Hey, this is Mrs. Camp, and we're looking at AP World History 1.6, Develops in Europe from circa 1200 to 1450. On this video, which is the second, we're going to be looking at the first two learning objectives here. First, explain how the beliefs and practices of the predominant religions in Europe affected European society, which we touched on some in the last video, and we're going to continue here. Explain the causes and consequences of political decentralization in Europe from 1200 to 1450. In this video, we'll be looking more at the consequences. In the last video, we looked at both the causes and the consequences. So let's go ahead and get started and go to Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus is a region that connected Central Asia west to Western Europe and to Scandinavia. There was a lot of trade in fish and furs and grain, and the cultural center, the city-state center, the governmental center was Kievan Rus. But note that it's a city-state, so it's a decentralized system of government. There is not a centralized system pulling these together, and that doesn't happen until much later. So in Kiev, they adopted Orthodox Christianity. They had really close cultural relationships with Byzantium, which at this point is where we think of as Turkey, essentially. And then what happens is the Mongols come in, and the Golden Horde specifically come in, take over the region bit by bit in a fairly short period of time. But they get the Russian princes on the way to start paying tribute because the Mongols wanted the land, but they did not want to rule it directly. So they had indirect rule where each of the princes had to pay tribute to them. This was on their way when they get to Kiev. They destroy Kiev, burn it to the ground. Goodbye, Kiev. And the area of Moscow, the Muscovite princes, are the ones who are kind of central at this region. As the Mongols try to go west, Europe says, I don't think so, you're kind of a big threat to us. And so they managed to stop the Mongols. But the effect of this is that Russia develops very, very separately from the rest of Europe. It's distinct culturally. The economics is not very intertwined, and we end up having very different norms, very different policies, very different political setup in Russia. For example, serfdom lasts a couple centuries longer than it did in Western Europe. The Mongols are frequently referred to here as the Tartars. The Tartars are kind of a subset of the Mongol Empire. Was a bunch of tribes that were pulled together, and the Tartars were part of these, and it was them that went ahead and collected tribute. So these nobles grew wealthy, and they said, hey, we really don't like this. We don't like paying tribute to these people, so they started collecting extra tribute from their people, got together, said, hey, let's work together here. And so a group led by the Principality of Moscow, led by Ivan the Great, stood up and took back the region. Now, the way he did this was spreading out and going to different areas. If you look at this map, we have the Principality of Moscow here in the green, the dark green, and over time, this area, which was basically the principality plus surrounding lands, started expanding. Under Ivan the Great, they get this whole kind of salmon-colored region. Okay, so they managed to take this over, and they managed to then kick out the Mongols, and they basically take back the area from them and start ruling it. Ivan starts ruling it separately as his own sovereign country. And then this sets the origins of Russian state and of more centralized government. So we've gone from city-states in Kiev to the Moscow's coming in with more of a indirect rule, and to Ivan saying, hey, let's pull all this together and taking over and starting to centralize rule. So let's move west to Western Europe, and we've got throughout the later Middle Ages, so the High Middle Ages, the monarchs start gaining more and more power. They take that power back from the feudal lords. So the lords who had lots of control and could did what they wanted, lost control to the monarchs. And that was a lot of tensions in there. They weren't so happy. But the monarchs started employing their own bureaucracy. They started centralizing power. And the people that, the military, the government structure worked directly from the king or the queen. And so we have a development that starts looking more like the map that you see today. England and France in particular start centralizing power and have lots of wars in there because everybody wants France. In France, King Philip II was the first one to start really developing a real bureaucracy. And he ruled from about 1180 to 1223. So we're looking at the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century. So later, Philip IV ruled almost 100 years later. Under him, we first have the Estates General. So they're a body of people that advises the king and has representatives from each of the three legal classes, which they refer to as état or estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. So if you look at this, we've got the clergy, which is the first estate, and the clergy doesn't really pay taxes. Then we have the nobility, the second estate, and finally the commoners, which is pretty much everybody else. So as I mentioned, the clergy doesn't pay taxes. Neither really does the second estate. They pay a little bit, but not very much. The third estate, the poor, paid almost all the taxes. Now the estate general, that body, did not have a lot of power, and actually at the eve of the French Revolution, they seized power, but the third estate broke off, and we'll go into all of that. But this is laying the grounds for the French Revolution. The problem here that the kings of France ran into is that they weren't financing the government, and they didn't feel a lot of ties to a central government. They don't feel a lot of responsibility to protect them, which King Louis XIV and King Louis XVI work on, especially 14th, work on solving that problem, but it doesn't work sufficiently to avoid a revolution. Let's talk about the Holy Roman Empire now. We've got German King Otto I was crowned Holy Roman Empire 962. This title had been given way back to Charlemagne. Now we have it in Central Europe, and his successors had a struggle with the Pope. So we have this church versus king dynamic that we've talked about going on. And so there's something called the lay investiture controversy, which is about whether or not a non-religious leader, which we refer to as secular, as non-religious, could give bishops, who are regional rulers, symbols from office. It had been only the Pope, who is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. So this problem was finally resolved in the Concordat de Worms in 1122, and the church became completely separate from secular authority, so it could do what it wanted. And the empire really stayed there for another several hundred years till it was destroyed during the 30 Years' War. And we'll look at the Protestant Reformation and what happened with the church during the next couple of units. The empire formally ended when Napoleon came in and invaded Central Europe in 1806. So that's really the end of it. But before that, it really had very little power and not a lot to do. In the meantime, going back to about 1000 CE, in 1054, the church divided into two branches. This was called the Great Schism. We've got the Roman Catholic Church, is what we were just talking about, that really, dominates Europe for the next 5 centuries. And then we have the Orthodox Church, also referred to as the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now we have the Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox, but that is what split off, and that is Greece to Russia. This is where the Orthodox Church has a lot of power. And if you remember, we'd already had the Roman Empire split into 2 sections. This is the church splitting into those 2 sections. Looking at the Roman Catholic Church, Europe, if you remember correctly, is feudal. And so until the monarchs start consolidating power, we have a lot of little lords who have their vassals and their manors and all of this. Just, the power was completely decentralized. And so the church was the most powerful and kind of kept things together. The church had the people who could read and write, okay? And not all priests could read and write. It really, you were unlikely to learn to read or to write unless you were part of the church. Manors, as we've mentioned before, have a small church and a priest, most of them. And then Christianity really got people to have a shared identity, though the language of the peoples, the vernacular languages, developed and really replaced Latin. And it got to a point where only the people in the church, the clergy, could understand the service, which was Latin. And the service was said in Latin until the 20th century. Education and art. So the church established the first university, excluding Cordoba, which we've talked about, Cordoba being an Islamic learning center. And most of the people who had time to and did write and come up with new ideas and such were religious leaders. Artists worked for the church, therefore they had religious themes which helped people to understand the Bible. So this is part of reinforcing the power of the church, was through art that represented it and taught the people who couldn't read what they needed to know to continue to be Christian. So there's this different parts. We've got the church having the great power, and they could pressure the lords. And we, for example, the bishop could tell the priest, no, you can't hold mass, and because the Lord was doing something the bishop didn't like. And so, hey, they don't have mass, which is the church service, and the serfs get angry because they need to have that. That is part of their culture, and that's part of their where am I going to go from this. The Roman Catholic Church had a huge hierarchy of regional leaders. We have bishops that are regional leaders. The Pope is referred to as the supreme bishop. All of the bishops owed allegiance to the Pope, and they were the ones who selected local priests. The local priests then had to be loyal to the bishops and to the Pope. There were monasteries, monasticism. These are religious communities that would be separate from the secular community, and they would run themselves. They're part of, they're essentially like a manor as far as economic functions and protection, but they belong to the church. And very often, if you were going to go into the monastery, if you wanted to have anything other than a drudge job, you needed to bring land with you. And second sons, third sons, fourth sons would often go into the church because they didn't inherit from their fathers, the lords. Women also could become nuns. This is part of how there got to be some power for women, and that there were convents. So women are developing power within the church, but not really anywhere else in Europe right now. So the Crusades. So Europeans wanted the Levant, the Holy Land, and that's in the Eastern Mediterranean, where it says Anatolia, that's modern day Turkey. This down here, Arabian Peninsula, over here, Egypt. This general area is what's referred to as the Levant. And this is where the Roman Catholic Church wanted to have a claim on. The Eastern Orthodox Patriarch, who was up here, had some issues, reached out to the Pope for assistance, Pope Urban II, who said, sure, we'll come help you. We need to get some stuff back from you, like land and power, but we'll come help you. And so we have a situation now where the Pope is saying, hey, let's send people over to take this back. Some things to note about the Holy Land is that this area is of spiritual significance to Jews and Christians and Muslims. And there's also a lot of trade routes go through here. And so that's really significant that way as well. European Christians had access to these lands for centuries. The Muslims did not bar them from those lands until shortly before the Crusades. So some of the stuff going on added to the pressures of to invade. We had primogeniture, which is the eldest son inherited the entire estate. Okay, and this left all of the younger sons with little to no access to wealth and land, which they want. So some of them would go into the church, but they also needed other ways to gain money. Okay, so therefore, let's go on the crusade. We've also got merchants who wanted access to trade routes. So we've got religious stuff going on, social, economic, and political, all of these combined to result in the Crusades, which was between 1095 and the 1200, military campaigns. The church, the Pope had said, you'll reach heaven sooner if you join a crusade. We had people's crusades. So there's lots of different waves, and we talk about the different waves of the crusades, or the different crusades. The thing that the Patriarch had reached out about was the persecution of Christians by the Seljuk Turks, who had come in and taken over Anatolia and the Levant. So the First Crusade was the only clear victory, and not going to go through all of the Crusades here, but one of the big ideas is that they really did promote that cultural exchange. We're looking at exchange of ideas, exchange of knowledge, technologies also. The Middle East had a lot higher standard of living than you had in feudal Europe. So, and the European Crusaders, who were exposed to the goods they could get through the Middle East, increased the demand for those goods. So we're going to pause, and I'd like you to write down to explain how the beliefs and practices of predominant religions in Europe affected European society. Okay, as we finish up, a couple of notes of some economic and social changes going on. In the late 13th century, Marco Polo, who was from Venice, traveled all the way over to China and visited Kublai Khan, which was modern day Beijing, and had descriptions. He actually had this written, he narrated it when he was in a jail back in Italy, but he narrated the customs and the experiences and what he saw when he was in different places, but then ultimately in Beijing also. But he talked about the Mongols and that they drank mare's milk. They heated their homes with coal. They had multiple marriages. And so people got very interested in Asia. Okay, and then we got an interest in cartography or map making. If we want to go to this area, we should have decent maps for it. So we really hear Marco Polo is one of the ways in which the Europeans started having more exposure to what's going on in the rest of the world and rejoining the rest of the world. Growth in long distance trade changed the social pyramid. We now have economic success that began to mean more than religious or military leaders. We have a middle class that's between the elites, the nobles, and the clergy, and the peasants starts to grow, and then actually starts to grow some and then really explodes when we get to the Industrial Revolution. But at this point, it's growing. We refer to it as the bourgeoisie, okay? Shopkeepers, merchants, craftspeople, small landowners. When we talk about the French Revolution, we'll come back to this idea of the bourgeoisie. Commerce came to larger cities, and we start having more towns and more cities. Agriculture, of course, leads to population growth. Population growth means more specialization of labor, and that surplus creates the ability of people to go to towns and start doing those other jobs. So we will come back to a lot of this in Unit 2. Have a great day, and see you next time.